Does anybody have any other questions they'd like answered about startup law, entrepreneurship, GameStop, anything, investing?
I have a question that's not GameStop related.
Sure.
I'm still a whole newbie at all of this, so I was hoping that you could speak to the life cycle of the startup and, talking through the beginning to the end and, what goes into that, at what stages should you bring in legal counsel, so on and so forth.
Yeah, it's a good question. So, a startup, I think when clients come to me, entrepreneurs, there's kind of, two different types. There's the startup client that we would, traditionally bucket in that, group of startups that are looking for outside capital. And then we have, other entrepreneurs that have startups where they're bootstrapping their company and basically trying to see is, how far they can get with, their own capital or using more traditional capital sources. But I think that, if we use the tech startup as an example that's looking for funding, I think it's really important to engage counsel early on and not just, trying to toot my own horn, but I'm talking about IP counsel, which is something, outside of what I do, but looking at, the name and logo that you want to use because you're going to be building brand equity through creating your brand presence in the marketplace, and you want to make sure that's protected and that you're not infringing on other people's rights, because a lot of what we do, on a day-to-day basis is drafting cease and desist letters for our client companies that are getting knocked off, and vice versa. So it's important to, establish, potential, name and logo up front, and really work with a trademark attorney who's doing comprehensive searches, not just like a manual search of the USPTO database, or in some cases, like a lot of people use LegalZoom, but they don't do a comprehensive knockout search that a trademark attorney will do. And that will give you further reassurance that you're using, a trademark or logo that, is not infringing on other people's rights, and you can feel confident that you're building your company and your company's IP, which has significant value, especially in the startup arena. That's something that investors look for is, does the company have legal rights to their IP? Is their IP defensible? And that's part of any investor's due diligence process. So the thinking that I do as a startup attorney for my clients starts very early on, and that's why I think clients should engage counsel very early on, because that's the first question, IP. The second is tax consequences, and a lot of people will just, form an entity online, which is completely fine, but they're not picking the right one because they're not thinking about the tax consequences. There are some cases where I would, advise a startup to be choose an entity type as an LLC or a C Corp. Traditionally, if they're looking for venture capital, I would say become a Delaware C Corp. But in some instances, I have founders who are sort of bootstrapping until they get funding. And, a lot of times those are the ones who have high IP value, and biotech companies where the founders are actually throwing in a tremendous amount of their own capital. And I want them to be able to use the benefits of a pass-through entity like an LLC to be able to offset any other income they have from losses in year one of their startup. So that's kind of the next step in the process from the eyes of a startup attorney. But so my recommendation is start early on, and then from that standpoint, it's if you're going to be if you want to be a company that's raising, capital, and you're putting very little of your own money, and you're incentivizing different, independent contractors. They could be, your web developer or your product, design development team, marketing, with sweat equity and giving them equity incentives. Delaware C Corp is the way to go, or a different C Corp, but investors tend to favor Delaware C Corp because of established Delaware law, business law, and just because it's become the norm in venture financing. And the next step is really just creating what I call the standard startup document package, which is really for any corporation. But with a startup, there's a couple of other documents that you incorporate that have become the standard in, venture deals, and that includes, in addition to, with a regular company, you may just issue stock certificates, but with a startup, because founders are subject to vesting, you would issue, restricted stock purchase agreements in addition to stock certificates, as well as confidential information assignments agreements and IP assignment agreements, so that investors down the line know that when they go into your due diligence war room, that you have, thought through all of these issues, and that you own the rights to your IP. And now your IP is not just, your logo and trademark, but we're talking about your product and the software behind that, and if you began the patent process or have patented it. So those are sort of early questions, and that's in the stage of like what I call the very early stage pre-revenue startup, and then as the company matures, from the initial founders and maybe having like a couple of contractors who are helping develop a product. If one of the founders, one or more of the founders is not, a technical person, they're often compensated in sweat equity, and the goal is to get your product, to its MVP, and see the, reaction of the marketplace to your product, and eventually get to product market fit. And that's in between, the start of the business and, the stage where you're getting your MVP, you're going to be also thinking about capital raising, right? So that's, an entrepreneur has to think about a lot of different issues in addition to, just trying to build and grow their business. But a big part of that is obviously financing, and they spend a tremendous amount of time fundraising, and from when working with early stage startups that you see mature, it's like every few months going through a new fundraising, exercise, in addition to managing your business and trying to scale it. So it's a lot of pressure, which often falls on the CEO or COO or whoever tends to have a lot of industry contacts in the company. But then from there, the company hopefully has product market fit, starts monetizing, and can raise a Series A round, which is the first round where an institutional VC will put in capital. And then, that's when a lot of the press and media will start to take notice of the company, because there's a real VC behind them, and, they'll be in Crunchbase, and, the world's on notice that this is a potential disruptor. And from there, you want to continue to grow, continue to find new ways of monetizing your product, new channels, and hopefully raise even more in your Series B. And a lot of startups, their goal is to exit within 2 to 5 years, and so that's their focus. So the life cycle for them is very much like a linear path from early stage startup to exit. But obviously on that linear path, there's tremendous uphill challenges that the founders will face and the entrepreneurs will face.
That's great. I mean, I'm so impressed with how you were able to keep track of each stage and go through the entire life cycle. I think that's like a really helpful breakdown. It's something that's super digestible for somebody who may not be as familiar with all the ins and outs of it.
Great. Well, I've also recorded this, so you can watch it later.
Perfect.
Tamara, is there anything you'd like to say?
Yes, I'm trying to do it. Sorry.
Yeah, I was just wondering, usually founders' main concern is to get rid of dilution, and what would be your recommendation from a legal standpoint?
Yeah, I mean, if you are, it's a good question. If you're a founder, that has to be on your mind from day one, because you're giving up your company every time you issue equity incentives to employees and consultants and advisors, and then you're giving up equity to investors because they'll want you to increase, the option pool. And then when you have investors come in, then not only are you getting diluted by an increased option pool, you are getting diluted by the investors. So in every round and with every increase in the option pool, you're getting diluted. So it's hard to say the best way to avoid dilution, because it depends on what type of company you have, how much money you have, and willingness to do certain things a little bit differently. So I think from the perspective of people who start a business with no money and are looking for complete venture funding, it's going to be hard to avoid dilution. But it's actually the lawyer's job in some sense, because the lawyer has to negotiate the terms, the term sheets and the financing documents for for these deals. And I'm working on one right now where the founders are going to be so badly diluted in a Series Seed round, which is an early stage round. They did a pre-seed, and now they're doing a Series Seed, and the founders are getting diluted by like 45% by the time they get to Series A. And why does that happen? It happened because they didn't start the company with a lot of money intentionally. They started with $10,000, and it's a high-tech SaaS company that requires sophisticated engineering teams and marketing people and community managers and things like that. And how do you compensate people if you don't have any money? You have to give them equity. So the advisory board, which I always recommend startups have, people who are industry experts or have great contacts or have had successful exits, they'll get equity. Employees, contractors, directors will get equity. And so in each round, you're going to get diluted. But I actually spoke to a Series A investor last night, and he said he does something very interesting. And he said that with a lot of companies that he sees, because he's Series A, he's already kind of at the other end of the spectrum of early stage, investor. So by the time that startups come to him, they've been so significantly diluted, the founders have been, that he said they do something called supersizing the equity pool. And what that means is giving the founders more equity through stock options, which will vest over time, but it gives more equity back to the founders because there's a disalignment of interests when a founder has, significantly less than majority control of their company, right? Because they've been diluted in the other rounds. So what he said is that, the founders are not going to have incentives to perform, once they get to the round where I'm investing. So we give them 10% back in the form of options, which I'm sure helps to keep the founders in their roles, because that's another 10% of equity in a startup that's just get backed by an institutional VC. So I thought that was pretty interesting. I'd never heard that before, and I actually recommended it to my clients who are in negotiations with an angel group as well as several New York-based VC firms. So great question, Tamara.
Thanks. So as so I think it sounds like it's the best way is to bootstrap the company, right? To avoid dilution.
I mean, that's the only way to truly avoid dilution, is to bootstrap a company. And, you know, if you don't want to bring on equity investors, there's venture debt, you know, where, you know, like Silicon Valley Bank and other lenders will lend to startup companies. And there's also traditional loans too, and there's, you know, other types of financings that you could get based on, you know, assets. So if you have revenue coming in, you can, you know, finance your business off of those revenues, and you may never have to tap the equity markets.
And what about crowdfunding? Maybe is it helpful, like, should the founder give some equity to raise capital on those portals, or?
Yeah, so it's a good question because it's becoming more and more prevalent, and I think it's a good alternative to venture capitalists because you can, you know, kind of control what you're going to be giving away. You can control the valuation, and, you know, if you have a successful raise on a crowdfunding site, you can publicize the hell out of it because you now have like potentially, you know, hundreds, maybe 1,000 investors in your deal, you know, who've helped finance your company. So it is a good alternative. The downside to it is you're not getting the strategic knowledge from VCs who are usually made up of some operators and former founders that have exited. So you kind of give up that when you go that route, but it has become a better option for founders more recently.
Thank you. Yeah, I think an advisor would be an option for them who are raising capital through crowdfunding portals, right?
Yeah, I mean, advisors in general are great because you're getting, you know, years of knowledge that you would have not otherwise, you know, be exposed to, especially if you're a, you know, younger founder. So, you know, you give away some equity, but that, you know, institutional knowledge and those brain trusts that you're, you know, selecting to be on your board is like invaluable, especially if they have ideas on how to, you know, market your business, grow your business, and finance your business if they have industry connections to venture capitalists and other people like that.
Thanks.
What do you say to founders who are super strapped for cash and are trying to cut corners and would rather go the LegalZoom route?
Yeah, no, that's actually a really good question because that's a lot of people that I meet, and even some amazing companies have started out that way. I think that you're just going to incur more legal costs down the line, but there's another aspect to it, and, you know, you could be doing some, I don't want to say damage, but you could be making mistakes that can haunt you later. Like, for instance, a very obvious one that we see all the time is the trademark issue. You know, people failing to start the trademark process, which is a long process. It could take up to 9 months, but if you get the process started right away, you can identify if you're going to be infringing on other marks, if, you know, there's any, you know, riskiness. But, you know, if you want to go on to like LegalZoom or Rocket Lawyer, and you know what type of entity you need for your business type and your goals, then that's fine. And some sites give you more startup-y type of documents rather than like LegalZoom, which is more generic corporate documents because they deal with all sorts of companies. But there are other sites that will get you in a good position, but then there's also the tax issue, and everybody's tax situation is different, and so you kind of have to move forward at your peril. But there are also, options to find, legal counsel for, reasonable rates, and, there are, mentorships and things like that, that a lot of startup lawyers do. And, like this, getting your questions answered here, literally for free. So there are definitely ways to find out what you need to know, but there's a lot of misinformation because there's so many, different sources that, if you Google, best entity to form my startup, you may be getting advice that's suitable for someone, but not another person, based on their, tax situation, based on where they live, based on, what type of company they're going to have. So, but at the end of the day, thankfully most errors you can fix with money down the line when you have it, but a really shrewd founder starts looking at legal counsel as part of their overall strategy. They, the same way they look at their, product, go-to-market strategy, their marketing strategy, and tax strategy. They think about their legal strategy, and the benefits of doing that for an early or any startup that's looking for venture capital funding is that you're signaling to investors that your shit. And the companies that come to me and they have like no money, but you could tell that the founders are bright and that they have a shot at making it, they're calling you when they don't have, a pot to piss in, but they have an amazing idea that they believe in. And you can kind of tell that these people have been researching and speaking to people and, getting a whole overall strategy for everything that a company will need to be thinking about. And when you show that, when you put somebody like that in front of a venture capital investor, it's pretty impressive. It really is, because it shows you have everything buttoned up, and it shows that you're thinking about these things in a strategic way. And if you're an investor, you're not going to want to give your money to someone who's gonna, piss it away because they don't have a strategy. You're gonna give it to someone who's been thinking about the strategy, months before they even got to pitch you. I don't know if that answers your question, but...
No, it definitely does, and I think it speaks to the fact that you can't look at startups, or at least the questions that you have about startups, you can't look at their answers as being one size fits all. It be specific to each thing, which completely makes sense.
Yeah, that's so true. It really is, and it really depends on, even the industry. Like if you're a biotech company and you're spending money on patents, and it may make sense to be an LLC until you're ready to raise capital, and you can either convert or have the C Corp own the LLC.
Speaking of patents, I'm curious to know what you suggest for, protecting your ideas. Like, let's say if I, have this amazing idea, but I know that I need a team of people, like an engineer and a lawyer and like a marketing person to like help me make it all come to fruition, but I still want to protect my idea in the event that something bad happens, but at what stage do you start, working up NDAs? Is that necessary? I'm curious to know what you think about all of that.
Yeah, every startup should have an NDA from the get-go. You should have an MNDA, and an MNDA is a mutual NDA where it works both ways. So, the startup, let's say a startup's engaging a web developer, they probably use a one-way NDA because the web developer is just performing services on behalf of the company. But in a situation where there's like a sharing of any confidential information, from either party, you would want to have a mutual NDA. So I always advise startups to have both in place as one of their first documents after their corporate formation documents, because if they're, if they have trade secrets and, really, any technology they don't want to get out into the marketplace without them doing it, then they would want to, make sure that anybody they engage with is subject to an NDA.
So let's say I have the NDA in place, my amazing idea is seen by everybody involved as an amazing idea, and we're able to start this and get it off the ground. How much should I be paying myself as this CEO with this amazing idea?
How much should you be paying yourself?
Yeah.
So it depends, if I think when you start generating revenue or receive money from investors, that's a big question. With revenue, it's a little bit easier because you can kind of base it off of how much you're bringing in and how much is going to your bottom line. When there's investors involved, and it depends, are you a pre-revenue startup or are you generating revenue? Because you're still going to be looked at, it's still going to be looked at unfavorably if you're taking, significant compensation if you're, pre-revenue. But, once you do bring in startup capital, it's often agreed that the founders will have a, employment agreements and will receive some cash, some equity. So even if they're pre-revenue, they can start to grow a salary, but investors will try to sometimes control that in a term sheet and in the deal.
Thank you. This is a little bit more separate and off topic, but I would love to know from your standpoint if there are any startups that you've admired for like their specific business models, and if there are, which ones are they?
That's a good question. There's a particular client of ours that's in the gaming space, and I admire them for their business model because the model is basically such that their product and their users become their own marketers. So they're in the clip capture space where a gamer can go in on their Discord channel, and type in the name of the company, and it'll go in and capture a clip of the gamer's, like a highlight of the gamer's like 30-second gameplay, and it'll send it to AWS and it'll be rendered, in the cloud, and then it gets, immediately posted to Discord and, our client's website, and then it kind of gets ranked, and gamers can go and modify these clips, and they're such high quality, and they're shared on Instagram and everywhere else. So part of their business model is like free marketing, and I thought it was brilliant because their goal is obviously to acquire users and make sure that the users love their product, which they've achieved. But the marketing aspect to it is really interesting to me because their cost to acquire users is really low, and as they scale, it gets lower and lower, and you have thousands of clips generated every day now because they've achieved like 10,000 active users who like love the product. So I admire that business model for an early stage startup.
Thank you for admired who have been on Shark Tank? I'm a big fan.
Of Shark Tank. Well, I thought, the what is that? The thing that you use to like scrub daddy, is that what it's called?
Yeah, scrub daddy is everybody's favorite.
Yeah, it's like it's cool looking. I think someone told me it works, and it just seemed like they have really good marketing, and they've got into like a lot of stores, and it's a product that is like pretty light to ship, so it works as a great D2C model as well. I think another one on Shark Tank that had a lot of success is Squatty Potty, which I thought was an interesting, an interesting company, and it's like everywhere. You go into like Bed Bath and Beyond, and they have Squatty Potty, and I think they've sold like millions of units. It's crazy.
It's amazing to see companies that are able to, go on Shark Tank and get their, jumpstart. But I'd love to hear more about, what funding options are available for startups that, don't have that chance to be on the big screen as they're launching pad.
Yeah, so again, like, when you asked me about the question about what you want to be thinking about early on, and in addition to, go-to-market strategy, marketing, legal, you want to be thinking about who invests in your space and what are the recent deals that have been done, where are investors, throwing cash, and are they investors, if you're on the East Coast, are they on the East Coast or West Coast, and see who in your network might have connections to those people. LinkedIn and social media is a great way to reach out. And the earlier the better, because I found much more success on behalf of my clients when I've cultivated a relationship with an investor, and the same is true when a startup founder reaches out, just to let an investor in that space know what they're doing. Not asking for money yet, just saying this is what we're doing, this is the market we're trying to go after. We think our product is, differentiated by XYZ, and try to keep in touch and keep that relationship going. VCs, by their very nature, have to be relationship people because they need deal flow, and the best way to go to someone is not through cold outreach, it's through warm outreach, either from you doing it yourself or your network, and that's where advisors can help too. And you can pick people you admire in your space, or people you find on LinkedIn to build out your advisory team, and they can help you with warm introductions. So there's a number of different avenues, and just reaching out and doing it in a way that goes a little bit beyond than just the, hey, here's my deck, what do you think? We need $3 million, because they look at a lot of those, they get a lot of those emails. So if there's some way to relate, if there's a commonality, because again, these are human beings, and if you can relate to humans, you can, I'm convinced you can close a deal.
That's great.
I have one question regarding tax reliefs related to startups. So can you give us some general understanding what kind of tax relief they have?
Yeah, so in terms of, that really goes back to the question of, entity formation at the beginning and what type of company you want to be. So if you are putting a lot of, money into your company and bootstrapping it, you may want to choose a, pass-through type of entity like a S Corp or an LLC to at least get some tax benefit and relief. With any losses you incur in, year one against any income that you might have from other sources. In terms of, thinking about tax relief from startups, it's really about planning for the way you grant equity and equity incentives. So, founders who are receiving any restricted stock or any, contractors or employees who are receiving, stock options that are subject to vesting. You want to be filing 83B elections, if you're close enough to the time of, formation before the valuation is really skyrocketed. And that planning in advance will save potentially millions down the line for startup founders, depending on, what valuation they are at the time of, later stage or exit. But there's another thing to think about with being a C Corp and being a, qualified small business stock, which is really favorable for investors, because if you have, angels or let's say venture capital funds that invest in a corporation that's, qualified small business stock, they could potentially defer or eliminate to some extent capital gains on their investments. So if you imagine a scenario where you invest, early on in Uber that, is a C Corp and it skyrockets, you're gonna have to pay a lot of taxes. But if you're treated as qualified small business stock, the investors can actually defer their capital gains, or in some cases eliminate it, which is a huge tax savings. So investors actually will make you represent in your term sheet for financings, that you will you'll be considered a qualified small business stock corporation, under the Internal Revenue Code. So that's a big deal for investors. So there's two ways of looking at it, from the founder side and from the investor side.
Thanks. Yeah, I think. I'm sorry.
Oh no! If you're talking about taxes, feel free to.
No. Okay.
I was just going to ask about, kind of like the obstacles that startups can run into, and, if you had a list of just like the top, most legal issues and kind of how to avoid them, or, what are those pitfalls that you're trying to avoid early on with your clients?
Yeah, so that's a good question. So, with IP, so trademarks, logos, I have companies that have built up significant brand equity and need to do a rebranding because they didn't do, adequately, check before they, check with the trademark counsel in advance whether, their name and logo was, can be used without infringing on others' marks. But also that carries over to forming your entity, because, you should be aware of, what, name you want to choose as you continue to build your brand. So that's one pitfall. The other that I see a lot is, a number of startups come to me as LLCs when they shouldn't really be LLCs, for the reason I mentioned before, with the fact that they want to raise capital from, institutional VCs down the line. They want to give equity incentives. And so that is a question of entity choice, right? So that's a second pitfall. A third that I see is going back to taxes. So at the very beginning, should you be treated as a pass-through entity, or should you be a corporation? And that really depends on the founders, whether they're bootstrapping it, or whether they're just putting in minimal cash and looking to raise venture capital. And I think another pitfall we see is not adequately, having agreements in place with, third parties, whether that's NDAs to protect confidential information, because I hear it all the time that, startup founders will have an idea, they're passionate about it, they informally bring, on a co-founder or an advisor, and they find out, like, they stop hearing from that person, and then they see that they've, joined the board of a similar company, a competitor, and, if you don't have, agreements in place to protect your IP and make sure that, early employees are assigning, any IP to the company, so it's owned by the company, and also having, the proper, NDAs in place, as I mentioned before, are big ones that I see, especially with tech startups. And so even if you don't, get to the point of, being able to, back to your question, Christina, about hiring an attorney, you could still put together a founders agreement, and there are plenty of NDAs out there, but you could put in place a founders agreement prior to forming any entity. It's just an agreement between the founders on like the rights, responsibilities, equity splits, things like that, which can form the basis of an agreement for when you go to start or form your entity.
Thank you. Once you've formed your entity and you've created your founders agreement, let's say you're in a position where you can take on employees. What are the employee classifications that founders should be aware of and be mindful of?
Yeah, so it's really that's a question that comes up pretty much with every early stage startup that is looking for outside capital. They don't have funds because they often will use a lot of independent contractors either in the U.S. or offshore or overseas, potentially for development work or marketing or whatever it may be. And you have to be really careful about classification of employees versus independent contractors, and there's maybe a majority of companies out there that have some, or should say startup companies that have some people that should be classified as employees when they're classified as contractors. And there's a number of reasons why that happens, and some of it is you are low on cash, so you're compensating in equity, but if you're controlling the manner and means of how that contractor is working with your company, in terms of controlling their hours and schedules, and if they have to work on site, and if you're giving them equipment that they need to use, that weighs more heavily in favor of an employment relationship. Also a big one that is not necessarily defined by case law, but every accountant will look at this one and be like, you're an independent contractor or you're not. And that's if you have another job. So if you have someone who is working at a company but they're doing freelance work for a startup, they could be an independent contractor and there's no issue. And obviously third-party vendors who service other customers, you're independent contractors. But if you're controlling hours and responsibilities and equipment and things like that, it weighs heavily in favor of an employment relationship rather than an independent contractor one.
Thank you for that breakdown.
Sure. Any other questions?
Yeah, I have another one. What are best practices when it comes to compliance with state and federal security laws?
So if you're raising capital and you're offering, equities in exchange for cash, then you have to think about securities laws. And generally there is some safe harbors that you could fall under, that where you won't have to register as a reporting company, and that's typically the case if you're raising capital from accredited investors. The SEC sort of taking the position that these type of investors are sophisticated based on either assets or their attestation that they're a sophisticated investor. But there are exceptions to that. So in some instances, you can have, up to, 35 non-accredited investors. And then you have, going back to crowdfunding, you could have, sort of the more democratized way of funding a company as opposed to the more traditional way of going to, accredited investors who were often, considered, wealthy, and, the investments would be off limits to, the average Joe. But, crowdfunding has opened the door to that, and it's become a more, legitimate way of raising capital than I think was initially seen when, funding portals started popping up. And I think it's a good alternative to, venture capital in many ways. But that allows you to accept a lot of money from a lot of investors. You have to make certain filings and be in compliance with the rules, and there's specific regulations around using funding portals to do the crowdfunding. But that's another way of raising capital for early stage startups. The issues that we see when people are raising, especially in a friend and family round, is that they don't necessarily file Form D with the SEC because they're just starting out and they haven't raised maybe that much money, and they don't want to go to the cost or expense. But you can open yourself up to liability by not doing that, and by not taking money from accredited investors in certain circumstances. So my thought on it is, I always advise companies to take money from accredited investors, with the exception of crowdfunding, because the legal work that goes into accepting money from smaller checks, and at the end of the day, those smaller checks from non-accredited investors can cause more harm than good in the end of the day, because those are not going to be necessarily people who are going to be around for the long haul, who can invest in other rounds at higher valuations. And typically, I see those checks are usually, 5 to 15,000, and the risk of taking that and not filing a Form D or complying with the SEC regulations regarding having non-accredited investors is just too high. So and also that's a lot of money for that person too, right? If they don't qualify as an accredited investor, that's a big percentage of their net worth. So if shit goes wrong, and it often does in a startup, because you're by the very nature of it, it's a risky business. Those are often the people that will be most affected, because on a percentage basis, that's the larger percentage of their net worth than an accredited investor who has to have either $1 million in net worth excluding their house, or have made $200,000 in income in the last 2 years, or $300,000 joint if they are filing jointly. So that's why I tend to recommend taking money from accredited investors. They're more likely to be around when you need them down the line to fill in the gap in your Series seed round.
That's great, thank you. And this should be my final question, but just curious to know, I know that the term unicorn startup gets thrown around a lot, and I'm just wondering if you can speak to, in your eyes, what you think makes a unicorn startup.
I mean, I think that everyone who's in the venture world, looks at, what deals are getting funded, and they track them, and, it's those companies that are nearing $1 billion, and you sort of watch them, raise capital from large institutional investors typically. But that's in terms of capital raising. But then there are companies that can grow organically and become unicorns, and they didn't necessarily have institutional VCs. But I think people think about it more in the context of the VC funded unicorns, like Uber and a lot of companies like that, Robinhood now. So when they hit unicorn status and reach that $1 billion valuation in like a series C through F round, then it becomes big news, and usually you kind of have those companies on your radar because you see them in Crunchbase, and you get newsletters about the companies that are growing and approaching unicorn status.
Thank you.
Well, we've had such a wonderful audience.